The frozen vastness stretched as far as Jacob's eyes could see. He was alone, completely surrounded by the unforgiving Arctic tundra, where the snow fell endlessly, and the biting wind whispered threats in his ears. There was no sound of life, only the distant crackle of the ice, as if the ground itself was begging him to give up. Jacob clung to the little hope he had left, but the cold was relentless, and his body was beginning to give in. He had gotten lost weeks earlier while on a photographic expedition to document the region's wildlife. It was a dream job, but it quickly turned into a nightmare when a violent storm separated him from his group. With no communication and no means of transportation, Jacob wandered aimlessly, desperately searching for shelter or some sign of help. The provisions he had with him ran out within days, and now he was at the mercy of the elements, with the snow and ice seeming endless. Every step he took felt heavier than the last. The accumulated exhaustion seeped into his muscles as the cold tried every way to steal his strength. He no longer felt his extremities. His fingers and toes, frozen and numb, had become useless. The wind, an invisible monster, whipped his face, constantly forcing him to adjust the wool mask covering his nose and mouth. But even that seemed like a monumental effort. The only company Jacob had was his own memories. He thought of his wife, Liza, who had begged him not to go on this trip. "Please, Jacob, it's too dangerous. Let's wait for a safer time," she had said, with that worried expression he knew so well. But Jacob, stubborn and passionate about what he did, believed he had everything under control. Now, as the ice closed in on him, her image haunted him, along with the regret of not having listened. He also thought of his son, Ethan, who had recently turned 5. The boy's smile was one of the few things still driving him to fight. "Daddy will be home soon," Jacob had promised before he left. But now, lost and exhausted, he wondered if he would ever fulfill that promise. More and more, the fear of not surviving began to take over his mind. The environment around him was merciless. Night was approaching, and with it, the temperature plummeted even further. The sky, which during the day offered a soft, almost comforting light, now turned into a dark and oppressive shadow. The stars, as beautiful as they were, seemed cold and distant, watching Jacob's solitary struggle from an unreachable point. He carried only the essentials, a backpack with a few basic items, but nothing that could protect him from the deadly cold threatening his life with every passing second. The Arctic's nature was both sublime and terrifying. The silence was deep, unsettling, as if the world was waiting for something terrible. Jacob knew he needed to find shelter quickly, or it would be the end. His trembling hands could barely hold the compass he carried. His fingers were blue, and the pain, once intense, was starting to fade, the first sign that his body was surrendering to the cold. In the distance, Jacob spotted what looked like a cave. His heart leaped, and he tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. Even so, with every last ounce of strength he had, he stumbled toward the cave, which seemed to be his last hope. He didn't know if it was real or a hallucination brought on by his weakening mind. But at that moment, he had no choice. When he finally reached the cave's entrance, Jacob collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The cave was small, but it offered some shelter from the wind. He dragged himself inside and felt a momentary sense of relief. He was safe, at least for now, but the cold was still unforgiving, and he knew it wouldn't be enough to survive the night. His mind wandered between hope and despair as he prepared for what he felt would be his last breath. It was then, in that moment of absolute desperation, that Jacob felt a presence. It was as if the very air around him had shifted. He heard a heavy rhythmic sound, something that echoed off the cave's walls. With his heart racing, he slowly turned and was met with something he never expected to see, an enormous and imposing polar bear. Jacob froze in place, and not just from the cold. His eyes locked on the creature before him. The polar bear, giant and majestic, observed him with piercing eyes. The sheer size of the animal was overwhelming, its white fur blending with the surrounding snow, almost as if it were an extension of the icy landscape. Jacob had seen many wild animals on his expeditions, but nothing compared to the grandeur of a polar bear up close, especially under such dire circumstances. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears like a war drum. He knew he was vulnerable, unarmed, with no proper shelter, and too exhausted to run. At that moment, his entire life seemed to hang by a thread the bear could easily snap. The animal breathed slowly, and with each exhale, a cloud of vapor formed in the cold air. Jacob knew polar bears rarely approached humans unless they were hungry or felt threatened. But there was no way of knowing what this bear was thinking. His instincts told him not to move, not to make any noise, and not to draw attention. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Jacob began to feel the weight of the situation on his shoulders. It was only a matter of time before the bear decided his fate. And, ironically, the predator now had full control over his life, but in a way he never imagined. Tears streamed down Jacob's face. They weren't tears of fear, but of resignation, as if his body had already accepted the inevitable. But then, something extraordinary happened. Instead of lunging at him as Jacob had feared, the bear calmly moved closer. Its movements were slow and deliberate. Every step the bear took sank into the soft snow of the cave. Jacob hardly dared to breathe, paralyzed by fear. Yet, to his surprise, the bear showed no signs of aggression. Instead, the massive animal seemed to be watching him with a kind of restrained curiosity, as if trying to understand what this human was doing in its territory. With his body still trembling, Jacob noticed something strange. The bear didn't appear hungry or threatening. It was calm. What did that mean? Was it a figment of his weakened mind? But no, the animal was there, firm, breathing heavily, yet with an air of serenity. Jacob, with the utmost caution, began to slowly move one of his hands toward his pocket, trying to reach the small lighter he had with him. Fire might, just might, scare the bear away if it decided to attack. However, before he could even light the flame, the bear did something Jacob never would have expected. It lay down. The immense mass of white fur and muscle simply settled into the snow right in front of him, as if it had decided there was no need to stand anymore. Jacob could hardly believe what was happening. The bear was resting. He looked around, checking for any other dangers, but it was clear. The bear was there, with him, in the cave, as if it wanted to share the shelter Jacob had found. Jacob's mind spun with conflicting thoughts. A part of him wanted to stand up and run, but his body was already too drained. Another part, incredibly, felt a strange sense of comfort. The warmth radiating from the bear's body began to heat the space around them, breaking the freezing grip of the cold that had dominated the cave. For the first time in days, he could feel the ice around him starting to melt, just a little. The animal seemed to be his only chance to survive the brutal night. As the hours dragged on, Jacob couldn't help but observe the bear's peacefulness. The animal lay still, breathing steadily, and its presence was becoming less threatening. It was almost as if there were a silent pact between them. There, in that frozen and desolate expanse, both were fighting for the same thing: survival. Jacob knew this chance was unique. If the polar bear hadn't been there, the cold would have already won. He needed to think of something, some way to ensure he could survive until morning. But above all, he realized that the bear wasn't there by accident. Maybe it was an impossible coincidence, but Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this animal had been sent somehow, as a guardian, as a reminder that nature, as cruel as it could be, also had a surprisingly benevolent side. As time passed, Jacob's body began to relax, despite the initial fear. Exhaustion overtook him, and he knew he couldn't stay awake much longer. He leaned back against the cave wall, still keeping his eyes on the bear, which remained lying down, calm. The warmth from the animal's body seemed to be saving his life, and for a brief moment, Jacob allowed himself to feel a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he would survive the night. With that last hope, Jacob closed his eyes. The fight for survival was far from over, But for now, he was no longer alone. Jacob woke with a start. The first thing he noticed was the pitch-black darkness inside the cave and the biting cold, far worse than before. The second thing was the silence, a silence so deep it screamed in his ears. Was the bear still there? He couldn't see the animal, and for a moment, panic surged through him. His body was aching, the cold gnawing at him relentlessly. What little warmth he had felt earlier seemed to have vanished. Jacob rubbed his eyes, trying to get his bearings, but all he could see was the cave's darkness, interrupted only by the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the small opening. He tried to move, but his muscles were stiff from the cold. Slowly, he began to crawl toward the cave's entrance, hoping to find the bear or at least understand where he was. Then he saw it. The massive polar bear was at the cave's entrance, motionless, its gaze fixed on the horizon. It seemed to be watching something out there, something Jacob couldn't see. The wind howled around the cave, sending swirling snowflakes like ghosts dancing through the air. The weather had worsened considerably during the night, and now a new storm threatened to engulf everything. But what caught Jacob's attention wasn't the storm, it was the bear's behavior. The animal stood still, staring intently into the distance. It was as if it was on alert, as though it knew something was about to happen. Jacob crawled slowly toward the bear's side, peering out in the same direction, trying to see what the animal was seeing. That's when he spotted it. Far off in the snowy expanse, a lone figure was moving slowly, a small, fragile silhouette against the endless white. Jacob's heart raced. There was someone else out there, someone lost in the frozen wilderness like him. But what disturbed him most was the figure's pace, painfully slow. It was clear that whoever it was, they were in trouble, just as he had been. For a brief moment, Jacob hesitated. His instinct told him to rush toward the person, to try and help somehow. But reality was brutal. He could barely move himself, and the cold was deadly. He knew that if he left the cave, the last bit of shelter he had, he wouldn't survive for long. Yet something inside him screamed that he had to do something. Jacob looked at the bear, as if expecting some kind of answer, some sign of what he should do. And strangely, the bear seemed to understand his hesitation. The animal took a few steps toward the distant figure, then stopped and looked back at Jacob, as if waiting for him to make the decision. Jacob was stunned. It was as if the bear was offering its help, waiting for him to lead the way. Driven by the urgency of the situation, Jacob stood up with difficulty. His muscles protested, but he knew he couldn't ignore someone in need. He took a deep breath, feeling the icy air burn his lungs, and began to walk toward the figure. The wind was merciless, each step a battle against the invisible force trying to knock him down. But he pressed on, stumbling through the deep snow, while the polar bear followed close behind, like a massive, silent shadow. As he drew closer, Jacob began to make out more details of the figure ahead. It was a woman. She was bundled in heavy clothing but clearly weak, barely able to stay upright. The snow wrapped around her like a cocoon, and her movements were sluggish, almost mechanical. Jacob called out to her, but the wind carried his voice away. He quickened his pace, and the bear did the same, always a few steps behind, watching carefully. Finally, he reached her. The woman could barely keep her eyes open, her face frozen and her lips blue. She tried to speak, but her words came out as a hoarse whisper, inaudible in the storm. Jacob grabbed her, trying to keep her from collapsing, but he knew he couldn't carry her back to the cave on his own. His own strength was nearly depleted. That's when the bear did something completely unexpected. It moved closer, its enormous paws sinking into the snow, and with a gentleness that was astonishing for a creature of its size, the bear leaned down toward the woman. Jacob, heart pounding, watched in disbelief as the bear allowed the woman to lean against its thick fur. The warmth from the bear's body seemed to ignite a flicker of life in the woman, and she clung to its fur as if her survival depended on it. Jacob couldn't believe what he was seeing. The polar bear, one of the most feared creatures in the Arctic, was somehow helping them survive. Together, They began to make their way back to the cave, the bear acting as support for the woman while Jacob did his best to assist. The wind howled around them, but in that moment, Jacob knew that the impossible was happening. When they finally reached the cave, Jacob laid the woman down on the ground, shielding her from the wind. The bear stayed close by, watching with an indescribable calm. The warmth of the bear's body began to heat the air around them once more, and Jacob, exhausted and still in disbelief at what had just transpired, leaned back against the cave wall. For now, they were safe. But Jacob knew this was just the beginning. The true challenge lay ahead, the fight to survive in these extreme conditions. And now, with another life in his hands, he couldn't afford to fail. The cave had become a sanctuary, but the fight for survival was far from over. Jacob watched the woman lying beside him, wrapped in the few layers of clothing that barely kept her protected from the relentless cold. Her lips were still pale, and her breathing was weak and uneven. The warmth from the polar bear, now resting near her, seemed to be the only thing keeping her alive. The creature, once a symbol of fear and danger, had transformed into their last beacon of hope. Jacob knew that if they were to survive, they would need food and a way to signal for help. However, he was utterly exhausted. His body, already weakened by the cold, was reaching its limits. The cold had seeped deep into his bones, and he felt waves of exhaustion threatening to take over. But now, with someone else depending on him, he had no choice but to find the strength to go on. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and Jacob knew that the weather was only getting worse. The storm showed no sign of letting up. Staying in the cave indefinitely wasn't an option. As much as it provided shelter from the storm, it wouldn't be enough to ensure their survival. They needed help, and fast. He glanced again at the polar bear. The animal lay there, calm and peaceful, its massive form radiating warmth into the small cave. Jacob couldn't explain it, but something about the bear's presence gave him a glimmer of hope. In any other situation, this creature would have been a threat. But here, it was their only ally. Jacob stood up slowly, his muscles protesting against every movement. His eyes fell on the woman again. She was still breathing, but barely. They didn't have much time. He needed to act. That's when a wild idea began to take shape in his mind. What if the bear could do more than just share its warmth? What if it could help them find a way out of this frozen wilderness? It seemed impossible, crazy even, but they were out of options. Jacob approached the bear cautiously, his body trembling, not from fear, but from the cold and fatigue. He knelt beside the massive creature, looking into its eyes. "I don't know if you understand me," Jacob whispered, his voice shaky, "but we need help. I need you." The bear remained still, but Jacob felt a connection in that moment, an understanding that defied logic. He hesitated for a second, then, driven by desperation, gestured toward the endless snow outside. They needed a path. They needed guidance. And somehow, Jacob felt that the bear could lead the way. Slowly, the polar bear rose to its feet, shaking off the snow from its thick fur. It took a few steps toward the cave's entrance, glancing back at Jacob, as if signaling him to follow. Jacob couldn't believe it. Was the bear truly offering to guide them? He wasn't sure, but he knew that staying here would mean certain death. Jacob looked back at the woman lying on the ground. He couldn't leave her alone, but he also couldn't carry her through the storm. His heart ached at the thought of leaving her, even for a moment, but he knew what he had to do. He had to trust the bear and find help. With a heavy heart, Jacob made the decision. He grabbed his gear, mustered every last ounce of strength, and followed the bear out into the storm. The cold wind immediately slammed into him, threatening to knock him down. Every step was a battle, the snow pulling at his feet, trying to hold him back. But the polar bear marched forward, unfazed by the elements, leading Jacob into the white void. The journey felt endless. The snow seemed to stretch on forever, an unbroken landscape of ice and wind. But Jacob didn't question the bear's direction. Somehow, He knew the animal was taking him where he needed to go. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, and just when Jacob began to doubt they would find anything, he saw it, a dark shape on the horizon. It was small at first, barely visible through the snow, but as they drew closer, Jacob realized what it was: a cabin. A small, weathered wooden structure, almost buried in the snow, but real. A wave of relief washed over him, bringing tears to his eyes. They had found shelter, real shelter. With renewed strength, Jacob hurried toward the cabin. His heart pounded as he banged on the door. "Help! Please, someone help!" he yelled, his voice hoarse from the cold. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man wrapped in layers of fur. His eyes widened at the sight of Jacob, and he quickly pulled him inside. Jacob collapsed onto the floor, the warmth of the cabin enveloping him. "There's another in the cave," he gasped between breaths. "And a bear. It saved us." The old man stared at him in disbelief, but there was no time for questions. He immediately called for others, and within moments, they were preparing to rescue the woman. As they geared up to head back into the storm, Jacob sat by the fire, trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. He glanced out the window, searching for the polar bear. The animal was still there, standing a distance away, watching them. It hadn't left yet, as if waiting to make sure the rescue was complete. Jacob met the bear's gaze one last time. Without making a sound, the bear turned and slowly walked away, disappearing into the blinding snow. It had done its part. It had saved them. And now, its job was done. Jacob sat by the fire, wrapped in a thick blanket, staring into the flames. The warmth was seeping into his bones, chasing away the cold that had nearly claimed his life. The rescue team had left to bring the woman back from the cave, and though he was too exhausted to join them, Jacob felt a deep sense of relief. They were safe, thanks to the polar bear, an unlikely savior in a place where death seemed certain. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. How could a polar bear, one of the most feared predators in the Arctic, have saved their lives? It defied logic. Yet Jacob knew what he had seen, what he had experienced. The bear hadn't been a threat. It had been a protector, a guide. And without it, both he and the woman would have perished in that frozen wasteland. The door of the cabin creaked open, and the old man and his companions returned, carrying the woman in their arms. She was wrapped tightly in blankets, her face still pale but showing signs of life. They laid her near the fire, and one of the men began to prepare something warm for her to drink. Jacob felt a lump form in his throat as he watched her slowly come to life again. They had made it. After a few moments, the woman's eyes fluttered open. Confusion clouded her gaze as she took in her surroundings. Where am I?" she whispered, her voice weak and raspy. "You're safe now," Jacob said, moving closer. "We found a cabin. We're going to be okay." She stared at him, her brows furrowing in disbelief. "But how? How did I get here?" Jacob hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "It was a polar bear," he finally said. It saved us." The room fell silent. The others glanced at each other, their faces filled with skepticism. The woman, too, looked at Jacob like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "A bear," she repeated, shaking her head slightly. "That doesn't make sense." "I know it doesn't," Jacob replied, his voice quiet but firm. "But it's true. That bear, it led us here. It kept us warm, guided us through the storm. Without it, we wouldn't have survived." The woman's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't comprehend it, but there was a sincerity in Jacob's voice that left no room for doubt. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would a bear help us?" Jacob didn't have an answer. He could only shrug, his eyes wet with emotion. "I don't know, but it did." The days passed, and both Jacob and the woman regained their strength. The cabin, though small and simple, became a place of refuge and healing. The storm raged outside, but inside, they were warm and safe, thanks to the old man and his companions. The woman, whose name Jacob learned was Emily, slowly pieced together the fragments of what had happened. As they sat together by the fire one evening, Jacob shared the full story: how he had been lost, how he had found the cave, and how the polar bear had appeared at the darkest moment, not as a predator, but as a guardian. Emily listened, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's incredible," she whispered. "I've never heard of anything like it." Jacob nodded. "Neither have I. But I'll never forget it." Eventually, the storm subsided, and a rescue team arrived to take them both back to civilization. The goodbye was bittersweet. Jacob had formed a bond with the old man and the others who had saved their lives, but it was time to return home. As they prepared to leave, Jacob stood outside the cabin for a moment, looking out at the vast, snowy landscape. He scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the polar bear, hoping for one last glimpse of the creature that had changed everything. But the bear was gone. As the helicopter lifted off, taking them away from the frozen wilderness, Jacob leaned back in his seat, watching the white expanse grow smaller and smaller beneath them. Emily sat beside him, her face still pale but her strength returning. She turned to him, her voice soft. "Do you think we'll ever know why that bear helped us?" Jacob thought for a moment, then shook his head. "I don't think we're meant to know. Some things just happen. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was something else. But whatever it was, that bear was the reason we're alive." Emily nodded, her eyes glazing over as she stared out the window. "I guess we'll never understand everything." "No," Jacob agreed, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. "But we don't always have to. Sometimes, surviving is enough." Final reflection. Jacob returned home to his family, forever changed by the experience. He embraced Liza and Ethan tightly, realizing how fragile life could be, and how precious the moments with loved ones truly were. The Arctic had nearly claimed his life, but a mysterious force, embodied by a polar bear, had given him another chance. The bear's actions defied explanation, but they had left an indelible mark on Jacob's soul. The story of Jacob's encounter with the polar bear serves as a reminder that even in the darkest and most dangerous moments, hope can come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, the forces of nature, which seem so cruel and indifferent, offer moments of kindness that change everything. And in those moments, we are reminded of the resilience of the human spirit and the mysterious connections that bind us to the world around us.